All right, hello everybody, and welcome back to Satisfactory. Today we're going to be talking about trains. We're going to start by going over the basics of trains, talking about how you can use them to build a large-scale logistics network in your world, and we'll jump into a testing world where we will look at some examples of how you might implement some of these ideas, and then finally we will take a look at some large-scale train networks in action. Let's get into it. Now, of course, if you're looking for something specific, there are timestamps in the description below. Let's start with the basics. Trains are unlocked by the Tier 6 monorail train technology milestone and will make use of rubber, steel pipes and beams, and motors to build, as well as a few other more simple components. Now, in addition to this, you're going to want to unlock the train signaling milestone, which will allow you to build some more complex networks through the use of signals, and these are going to require computers both to unlock the milestone as well as to build in the world. Now, trains run on railways, which are built from steel beams and steel pipes, and you can build these in segments of up to 100 meters. When you build a railway segment, it's naturally going to curve left and right. It's going to sort of have that curved build mode to it. And this includes curving vertically based on terrain. So if you want perfectly straight rails, you should make sure you're building on foundations. Now, rail lines can connect together to form a network, and you can also merge one rail line into an existing one in order to create an intersection. When a train approaches an intersection, there will be a switch displayed, which you can change by pressing A or D to determine which path your train will on. Trains on autopilot will ignore these switches. Now, trains themselves require at least one locomotive to be at the front of the train, and then you can optionally include freight cars behind them as well as additional locomotives. Now, in general, when you structure your trains, you're going to want one locomotive for every 4 freight cars, and you can have additional locomotives if you want to accommodate more cars in this 1:4 ratio. You can also place locomotives on the back end of the train in order to have a push-pull train or a bidirectional train. Now, trains are used to carry freight between stations, and a station can be built and then track connected to it in order to allow trains to use that station. Now, when you build a station, it's going to have an arrow sort of facing forward through the station, and trains can only enter the station from the back. Generally, trains will then proceed forward through the station to exit, although if you have a push-pull train, you can back out of there. Again, that requires a locomotive on the opposite end of the train facing in the opposite direction. Now, trains are mostly going to be running on autopilot, which is guided by a timetable, and you can alter the timetable from any station. Once a rail line with at least 2 stations is built on it, you can construct and then assign a train to travel between those stations, as well as specify what cargo is loaded or unloaded at each station. And the train will then proceed to travel between the stops in order according to its timetable. Now, when a train stops at a station to either load or unload, that station shuts down for 20 seconds. That means it won't accept new cargo coming in or be able to unload cargo during that 20-second window. So it's helpful to build a storage unit at each train station where you're going to be loading or unloading cargo to act as a buffer. Now, this is only strictly needed if you're moving large numbers of items, and in particular more than a third of a stack per minute. And so as a rule, it's a good idea to do it at every station because you never know when you're going to want to increase the throughput of a station to expand a factory in place or introduce new production lines. Now, once a train has completed a stop, it will then move on to the next station in its timetable. Now, when traveling between stations, trains are going to follow the shortest path. This means you can't have things like bypasses because trains are only ever going to move along the shortest path between stations. If the shortest path is blocked, they won't look for another route. They'll simply pause until the obstruction is cleared. And so this is where things get interesting. If 2 trains meet on a railway, they will collide, with one train smashing into another like you hitting that like button. And this will cause the trains to derail, which means you'll need to manually clean it up by visiting the wreck, pressing E to re-rail the trains, and then either moving or removing one of the offenders and re-enabling autopilot. In order to avoid this, we can give some instructions to trains about how they can move through the rail network such that 2 trains never collide, and this is going to be done with signals. Now, fortunately, signaling in Satisfactory is actually quite simple as long as you follow a couple of simple rules. These signals divide a rail into blocks, and when you're placing a signal, you'll see that the tracks take on this sort of color coding, which indicates what all the different blocks are. And there are 2 kinds of blocks. There are normal blocks, and these are created by block signals. And a normal block has the rule that only a single train can be within it at a given time. If a train approaches a block that is already occupied, it will pause and wait for that block to clear before proceeding into it. Now, the second type of signal is a path signal, which will create a path block. Now, a path block has some interesting properties. The first of which is that a train cannot stop within a path block. This will prevent a train from pausing within something like an intersection and creating a situation called deadlock, where multiple trains are each sort of waiting for another to move. And the second property is that path signals will actually trigger the game to do some more advanced calculations about which rails are actually going to be in use. And this is valuable when you have a complex intersection that has multiple rail lines passing through it. When a train comes to a path block, the game will actually perform the extra calculations to determine which rail line specifically that train is going to be occupying. And if there is another safe rail line through that same block, then another train will be allowed to use it, and therefore they can share the space. And so this makes path signals and path blocks really well suited for intersections. So if you want to build a network that's going to work well for you, there are a couple of simple rules you need to follow. The first one is that trains should only ever be allowed to travel in one direction down a given piece of rail. Now, there's a little bit of an exception to this for the sort of terminal stations for push-pull trains, which we'll take a look at when we get into our testing world. But in general, if you have a rail line that travels between two different parts of your map, you only want trains traveling in a single direction along that rail line. The second rule has to do with how you're going to divide up your track with signals. You'll want to divide your track with block signals, except that at the beginning of every intersection, you'll want to place a path signal. That is, every valid entrance to an intersection needs to have a path signal, and every valid exit from an intersection needs to have a block signal. And following these two rules will create a train system within your world that is going to be safe and stable and reliable. All right, we are here in our testing world where I have set up a handful of systems that will demonstrate some different properties and concepts about trains. And so let's start out over here. I want to highlight what deadlock looks like and how this affects some of the signaling. So this is a case where our trains are in deadlock. That is to say that there are three trains and each is waiting for the train in front of it to move. If we go into our signaling interface, we can see all the different paths or all the different blocks within the train signal. And we can see that this train here is sitting in the yellow block, and it wants to proceed into the purple block and then on into blue. However, the purple block is a path block, so a train can't stop there and therefore can't enter it until blue clears. Now over here, we have a train that is waiting for the green block to clear, and you can see that this train, even though it's technically within the blue block, it's actually sort of sticking backwards into the green block, which is reserving both of those, and that prevents that train from moving forward. And then this train, because it's waiting at the beginning of an intersection, it can't enter the orange block until the yellow block is cleared, and our first train is still sitting in the yellow block. Now, in order to resolve this, all we need to do is to do a little bit better about dividing up our paths with some block signals. So we can place a block signal, for example, right here, facing on the right-hand side going forward. And that will allow the train that was sitting in yellow to proceed through the intersection into the purple block. With that train gone, the train that was at the station can then proceed into the yellow block, and the train that was waiting for green to clear is now able to advance into the station. As a rule with block signals, you're going to want to place a block signal to divide up your rail network into lengths that are about the same length as your longest train. If you have a single locomotive with 4 cars, that's going to be 40 meters long, and so you'll want blocks that are about 40 or maybe a little bit bigger with them. So if you have something like this long block here that's a couple 100 meters long, you may want to subdivide that. Now, it is of course possible to use longer trains, and so you can see an example of that over here, for example, where we have a train with 2 locomotives and 15 cars. This was just a hill test I was running, and so you can have quite long trains, and in that case you'll want longer blocks. Now, this is an example of one of the simplest forms of a rail network that will use the basic rules that'll use these sort of basic rules to create a sustainable one. Trains can only ever travel in one direction along the main loop, but we do have a terminal station which creates a sort of hiccup to that. But it's important that this is sort of a unique case and that we don't allow the train to travel backwards, and we enforce that using signals. Over at our other stations, we can see that these are inline stations, and so a train can either bypass these entirely by traveling down the center line, or it can head into either station on the left or right as it needs to. Now, as far as signaling goes, the rules again are quite simple. Wherever you have an intersection, you use a path signal on all of the valid entrances and a block signal on all of the valid exits. So in this case, a train traveling forward along this path can enter the intersection here, so we have a path signal. From here, they can proceed straight forward, which means we'll have a block signal at that exit, or they could turn left, which means we'll have a block signal there. Now, coming from this station, we're once again entering the intersection, so we have a path signal on the right. We don't want to be able to travel to the right, so we don't have a block signal indicating that as a valid exit, so the only block signal sits here on the left. Now, this sort of single rail network works really well and is quite simple, but can lead to some throughput problems. The trains sort of have to wait for each other before they advance through the rail network. And if a train wants to travel to another station, they sort of have to loop all the way. And so this kind of network can lead to some throughput and congestion problems, which can be solved by using a dual track system. So over here, that is what we have. In this case, we have 2 tracks, but again, they each follow those same basic rules. Trains can only travel in one direction on a given track. So this is a right-handed system, which means that trains traveling forward will always be on the right. Trains traveling backward will always be on the left. And this introduces some more complex intersections like this one here, but we use the same rules. So in this case, for example, we have a path signal. So in this case, we have a train that might be coming along this way and could either proceed forward through the intersection or turn right. So we have a path signal marking this as a valid entrance, and we have a block signal marking both of those 2 exits. This is repeated at each of these 3 sort of valid entrances. So we have a path signal here marking a valid entrance, a block signal marking the exit if they want to go right, and a block signal marking the exit if they want to go left. And same on this side, a path signal or a valid entrance, block signal and a block signal at each exit. Now, when you're using a dual track system like this, in order to make optimal use of it, you do want the turnarounds on it. And so that's what we have over here. This is a opportunity for trains to reverse direction. So a train, instead of traveling sort of around the loop, can instead hook right here and loop backwards. But that does mark this as an intersection. You can see the tracks cross, and that is not something we want a collision on. So we do have a path signal that marks this sort of teal block as an intersection. And so from here, the trains could exit either into the sort of olive green or into the orange. So those are our block signals. And similarly, the red block into the teal block is a valid entrance, but from here, the only exit is into the olive one. And so that's the only block signal that you can get to from here. And we have a turnaround for traveling in the opposite direction over here. Now you can join these, and that's what we have here. This essentially allows each of these sections to act as a bypass. So we have this train that wants to travel. When it comes into one of these passing sections, it'll keep right, and that will allow the train that is waiting to then clear and enter the next section. We can see another interaction coming right here. And again, because this is a path block, it allows these trains to bypass each other on these passing sections. And so this sort of system works as well, and it's kind of the mix between them. Now this test was simply to see, like, this was the steepest slope I could build using foundations, not bound to the terrain in the world, and just seeing how much a single train could haul pulling up that rail, and a single locomotive was able to pull 14 cars but failed on 15 cars. But a second locomotive, and you can see that it barely slows down on the big slope at all. So trains can bolt quite a lot. Mathematically speaking, there are slopes that will fail if a train has more than 4 cars, though. So that's recommended as a limit for that. Over here, I was testing to see if there was any way I could get the trains to use sort of a priority loading junction. This does not work at all. I don't recommend it. If you want to use a queuing system, then you can use something like this structure over here, which is just a long rail network where trains are allowed to stack up. This is not very efficient. I don't recommend it. But Satisfactory's signaling does not allow anything like this. All right, let's pop into a world and take a look at some trains in action. All right, here we have a large late game factory. This was built during early access, and it was all the tier 7 and 8 factories at that time, and it is being provided by trains using a dual rail system. As we saw before, this is a right-handed system, so trains travel forward on the right and backwards on the left. Now, in this case, we have our main sort of spine that travels the length of the factory platform, and then the trains that provide for each factory divert from that, travel into the station that supplies for that factory, and then carry on. There is a loop around at the far end, which allows the train to exit the platform and head back out to gather more resources in the world. So you can see this yellow train coming in here, where it will unload the materials into the factory. All right, here we have a train network that uses a terminal station for loading some copper ore onto a train. And this one is interesting because it highlights one of the challenges that comes from using these sort of terminal stations. See, in this case, we have the train that enters along this path and pulls into this station. What that means is that the coal here is being loaded onto the third car back. But when it pulls out of the station, it pulls out traveling in the opposite direction, which means that the coal is then going to be loaded on, which means the coal is going to then be on the first car. So you need to keep track of this between stations, especially if you have multiple stops like this, so that you don't misplace your platforms and are able to load and unload in the correct slots with your train sort of flipping direction there. You can also see a rail spiral here. This is done pretty simply, and I'll go ahead and put the video up of this being built using the 2-meter ramps, but it's a 5x5 2-meter ramp spiral that you can then place the train tracks on, and this is one of the best ways to travel vertically up and down. You can also make these a little bit bigger and then sort of dual integrate them, so you have one spiral going up and another spiral going down in the same direction, and so that's a pretty cool trick. One thing I like about this particular rail network is that it does take the trains through the caves, and I really like the look and feel of trains traveling through the caves when they are hauling cargo. It also lets you retrieve some of the resources from some of these underground areas, like the quartz and Samor that's down here. Now you'll notice that some of the train cars are carrying fluid cargo. And fluid cargo is a little bit interesting, but it's a very effective way to move fluids uphill, because normally to move fluids uphill, you need to use pumps with pipelines, but trains just use electricity to run, and you can use either just inclines or spirals to move to sort of any vertical height, and that works just fine. So trains are an effective way to move cargo uphill. Now, sorting systems and malls are a little bit out of fashion in Satisfactory with the advent of the Dimensional Depot in 1.0, but here you can see here that this is what that might look like, where we have a train that unloads all of its cargo to go into a sorting system and then sinks any excess, and this is actually fed by several different factories. So an oil refinery comes in here, an aluminum factory comes in here, crystal oscillator factory, computer factory, heavy modular frames, are all unloaded at this one station and sent into the sorting system. Anything that doesn't fit in those storage containers then gets sunk. Again, this is an early access build, and this technique still works if you want to have a large amount of resources stored in one location, but with the use of the dimensional depot, this is much less necessary. If you're using a 2-rail system, this is an example of what a turnaround might look like. And this simply allows trains traveling in either direction the opportunity to loop back and travel into reverse direction at this location. You put these in periodically just to make sure your trains don't have to travel too far before they turn around in case they need to access a station that doesn't connect in necessarily the way you might think or expect. And here's another example of what one of those might look like. Again, this uses those same rules of a path signal at the entrances and block signals at the exit. On the opposite side, we have a path signal at the entrance and a block signal at the exit. And I think that's going to do it for today. I hope you guys have found this guide to trains in Satisfactory helpful. Leave a like if you have and subscribe if you'd like to see more. My name is Dakoba, and I hope you have an efficient day. I will see you soon.